Ansel, welcome to the team. Great to have you on board. And thank you very much for the first bit of work that you've done for us, which is a review of the regulatory landscape. Like now that we are a year after the introduction of ChatGPT, or at least it being let loose on the world. We've written quite extensively on the subject of AI in the past year, and had noticed that, like, maybe regulation isn't out of order. So you've kind of done a little bit of a review of the landscape. Perhaps you could give us that review, please.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, super happy to be here, and it's been a really exciting first few months. Um, yeah, so organizations like the OECD had kind of started to outline a framework for organizations to start regulating AIs, but obviously the OECD is more of an advisory body. It's almost telling legislative and regulatory bodies how to prepare and how to set up legislation once they do want to start legislating these AI systems. So I think really the first really big piece of legislation that businesses and organizations are going to start having to become aware of, because it does start having, legislative teeth to it, is the EU AI legislation, which has come into force recently. It has kind of a staggered implementation timeline, but the first provisions of that act have just come into force. And so we thought that it is a good point for businesses to start taking note of those regulations.
Well, so that's great. So what are the requirements then? What are companies required to do?
Absolutely. So, I mean, the first thing that the legislation is asking businesses to do is obviously to identify those systems within their sort of everyday business that would be considered AI systems. So, in order for the act to sort of be binding on businesses, uh, there needs to be sort of the connection to the EU, obviously it being EU legislation, so sort of trade into and or with EU entities. And then it's sort of the use and deployment of AI systems. So they keep a fairly broad definition of AI systems. It's really to do with sort of the autonomy provided to a system, and then just the amount that the system itself can adapt as it is being used and deployed. So it really is wide enough that I think most businesses and organizations should take a review of systems that they deploy and just see if those systems would be categorized as AI systems under the EU Act, because that may incur on you some responsibilities under the EU AI legislation. The next thing that it's asking you to do is to classify those AIs. So the way that the Act is sort of set up is sort of the risk of different systems. So it moves through kind of unacceptable risks. So those are AI systems that are sort of intentionally designed to manipulate or mislead. Those are completely unacceptable. And so, their guidance is that you are not allowed to deploy those kind of systems. And there's some pretty harsh penalties if businesses are found to be deploying those systems. Then moves through sort of high risk, so sort of your educational and law enforcement deployments of AI systems, where you start taking on quite a few sort of like risk management and reporting responsibilities. So, you sort of can deploy these AI systems, but there are a fair amount of responsibilities imposed upon you if you want to deploy these systems. And then there are limited and minimal risk systems, which limited, you still have some reporting responsibilities, but that's more towards your sort of deployers and customers. So you need to make them sort of aware of when they're interacting with AI systems. And then minimal risk is really just keep aware of it, keep your documentation up, but it doesn't actually legally enforce any requirements on you. So that's really how it's set up is sort of, you need to identify your AI systems, you need to classify those, and then from that classification of your AI systems, you may have some further responsibilities placed on you if you want to continue deploying those systems in sort of interacting with EU citizens or businesses.
So there's some responsibilities to, like, do a risk assessment and implement a set of controls appropriate for those risks. Are there any frameworks that that businesses have got to work with to identify those risks and identify what controls should be in place?
Yeah, absolutely. So currently, I think the most well-known AI risk framework would probably be published by NIST, who'll be sort of fairly widely known for their cybersecurity frameworks. But they also publish a risk assessment framework for evaluating one's own AI systems and sort of managing and mitigating those risks.
Great. So like NIST is very like North American focused. So is there sort of is there a framework or frameworks that exist outside of the North American focus that people would be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. So I talked about NIST's cybersecurity frameworks, and I think a lot of people will also be familiar with the ISO 27000 family of frameworks published by the International Standards Organization. Um, and so they also, in response to sort of the emergence and the adoption of AI systems, have published the ISO 42000 framework of like risk management and controls around AI systems. So actually, if an organization was looking for an international set of controls and they wanted to even certify themselves as sort of properly managing the risks associated and inherent with AI systems, they could absolutely move towards the ISO 42000 and the 42001 certification if that's what they were looking for.
So if there are companies that have made themselves compliant with ISO 47000, sorry, ISO 42000, or indeed the NIST framework, does that mean that they are automatically in compliance with the Act?
So these frameworks, I think, we're tackling them at the right time, but they're definitely sort of in a very nascent stage. So there really isn't the sort of casework for the interaction between these frameworks really out there for me to be able to sort of give you an answer with any certainty on how they will interact. I can certainly say that they are all set up with a similar goal of sort of mitigating the risks and the harms that may be inherent in using AI systems. So definitely, if you are conducting a risk assessment under, the NIST framework or the ISO 42000 framework, you're definitely going to be further along towards being compliant with the EU standards than someone who's taken no notice of it whatsoever. But I definitely wouldn't want to say that that there's definitely compliance guaranteed by adherence to either of those two frameworks, just because they've not really had the time to interact with each other yet. And I think that'll be a fascinating development as sort of this set of laws comes into force.
And then, I'm sorry to speak over you. What are the penalties if you find yourself like not in compliance with?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that was part of why we thought it was sort of time to start talking about these because the EU AI legislation really can get quite stringent with non-compliance. So I think it caps out at a penalty of about 7% of worldwide global revenue for sort of findings of non-compliance, which, as you can understand, for a lot of businesses is going to be a very significant penalty if they're found to be non-compliant. And obviously, it's sort of casting a wide net of who's connected to the EU. So as companies start to adopt AI systems more and more, it's something that I think we're all going to have to be very aware of.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a great sort of brief overview of the regulatory framework around AI. It'll certainly be something that I think our followers will be very interested in how it develops over the coming months and years. Thank you very much for the work.
Absolutely. Glad to have been helped.